Welcome to Rural Remix, your source for deeper, richer stories about life in rural places. Where do horror movies happen? Small towns, dark forests, cornfields, and farmhouses have each been the locations for iconic scary films. But why are rural settings so popular, and how do these choices affect the areas represented? The Rural Horror Picture Show is a 5-part series that explores the often flawed, but always interesting, depiction of rural people and places in horror movies.
Today we are taking a closer look at some iconic movies from the 1970s, and their infamous villains, the killer hillbilly and his degenerate rural family.
Hello and welcome to the Rural Horror Picture Show. I'm Susanna Brown.
I'm Anya Patrone-Slepian.
And welcome to episode 2. We are so excited that y'all are tuning in. So, Anya, today you are leading the charge for today's discussion, and I'm so excited to hear from you. But first, I have a fun little activity for us.
Okay, what is it?
I thought it could be good for us to maybe talk through some titles that never were. As you all know, as we just said, this is the Rural Horror Picture Show, but this was not the only idea we had for the name of this podcast. And I think we came up with some really great ideas, and they need to be shared.
I think some were better than others. That I'd say that they're all
sure.
really great. But yeah, it was sort of like a week-long brainstorming process with a lot of people involved, a lot of focus groups made up of our friends and family.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I think there are a few that I'm sort of mourning the loss of. I will say that the title for this episode, Killbillies, was actually one that we were considering as the overall series title. So that one still gets its moment in the sun.
Oh, definitely. I think we leaned into puns for some of them.
Also rhyming. We love
also
to rhyme.
rhyming. So I was thinking it could be fun to do a little rapid back and forth of some of the titles that could have been, and yeah, highlight any of our favorites that were there. I want to first give some love to the title The Final Girls.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would have been really great, maybe for a more gender-focused podcast, but The Final Girl is the trope in horror movies where there's the one woman who remains at the end of the movie. You see it in a lot of movies. A lot of the movies we'll be talking about today as well. I think it's a great name. We're two girls talking about horror. It's awesome.
Yeah, and finally, we stopped talking at the end. My favorite in that direction was the Blair Bitch Project,
so
which
good.
Also I thought was going to be really good for a gender-focused podcast. But that's not exactly what we're doing, so I'll let that one go.
It's amazing. I'm just going to say like a couple very silly ones. We've got Scary Prairie.
Yes.
Screamed Corn. And I think Rural Haunts is pretty fun.
Yeah, one of our coworkers suggested Killer in the Cornbread, which,
Rural Slays, that was one, maybe a little
slay.
Gen Z of us.
Maybe slightly.
So now that we know all that could have been, we want to, again, say welcome to the Rural Horror Picture Show, but if you want to think of it as Scary Prairie or Screamed Corn or the Blair Bitch Project as you listen, feel free. So yeah, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, well, today, as I sort of hinted at last week, and as the name of the episode might imply, is the Killer Hillbillies, or the Killbillies episode. So yeah, we'll just introduce the movies that we're going to talk about primarily really fast. All 3 of them are sort of classic urbanoia movies. They're all from the 70s, and those are Deliverance, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Hills Have Eyes.
Yes.
And they all share the basic urbanoia plot, which we outlined last week, which is that urban people, sometimes a family, sometimes friends, arrives in a rural area, sometimes by accident, sometimes sort of on purpose, and then is hunted or, in 2 cases, murdered and eaten by this figure of the killer hillbilly. But yeah, that is something that they all share, and honestly, if you know that about those 3 movies, that's kind of enough to go on for this whole episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is, for me, of these 3 movies, 2 of them are really I lumped together, which is Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes. The one thing about Deliverance is that I didn't really think of it as a horror movie. For me, there were so many other things I was focused on about the movie that being afraid wasn't really one of them for me. In some ways, the lower budgetness of Texas Chainsaw and The Hills Have Eyes made it, I'm not going to say a more enjoyable watch, but there's an element of almost camp to them that change the viewing experience, whereas Deliverance did not have any of the low budget slasher vibes, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you pointed out those differences, and we are going to definitely get into them more. But I think it is important to note that, like you said, Deliverance is a much higher budget. It's more of a studio production. It received critical acclaim. It was
Mhm.
nominated for Best Picture in the
Wow.
Oscars the year it was released. That is not the case with The Hills of Ice or Texas Chainsaw
No.
Massacre, but both of those movies did receive more of a cult following as time
Yeah.
went on. Another interesting thing you said about sort of Deliverance not being scary in the same way is that you're right that it isn't really a horror movie, but something that I found is that as I've been reading all of these books and articles and talking to people about these sorts of movies, everyone's like, yeah, Deliverance isn't really a horror movie, but it's so sort of iconic in
Mm.
the things that it did. And it also is so interesting to talk about that everybody just talks about it anyways.
Yeah.
And so we are just going to follow in that tradition and say, this movie's a little bit different from the other two that we're talking about. But I think that actually sets us up for some really interesting comparisons, which I'm excited to get into.
Definitely.
But before we do, I kind of want to have a quick conversation about the term hillbilly, which
Mm.
we've already used a couple of times
Yeah.
and which is going to be sort of used throughout. I think it's super important to note that the term hillbilly is in a lot of ways a slur, but also there's some effort to reclaim it. In this episode, we're really only going to ever use it to describe characters and stereotypes that are in the movies. We'd never apply this term to actual people,
Yeah.
but sort of the movie term for these characters, they are caricatures of this sort of iconic figure, and that figure is the hillbilly, as in other movies it's the monster and things like
Right.
that. So that's what we're going to use. And so that being said, I do want to talk a little bit about sort of the history of that term and the meaning of the term. There's a really great documentary that came out in 2018 that's called Hillbilly, and it sort of traces the evolution of the hillbilly stereotype in American culture, and also I think makes this really interesting link to the corporate exploitation of Appalachia's natural resources, which is something that we're going to talk about more later. So the stereotype historically has often been played for comedy, right? Like you'll see lots of SNL skits using it, back in the day, South Park, right? Like
Mm,
there's a
definitely.
hillbilly character in The Simpsons. So
Yeah.
there's always a comedic element to it, but it can also be scary, as we've seen in the movies that we've watched. So here's a bite of the documentary.
In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the local color writing presented Appalachia as a sort of quirky and quaint peoples. But as industrialists become interested in the region for minerals, for lumber, for later coal, the people that were living there could also be seen as a kind of potential threat, or at least interference with their economic plans. And so a new conception emerges of them as a dangerous and threatening people who might threaten civilization itself.
So that was Anthony Harkins, who is a history professor at Western Kentucky University, and he has written the cultural history of the figure of the hillbilly. There are 2 points that I want to make before we get back to the movies about the term hillbilly. The first is that even though it sort of originates talking about Appalachian people, it's not geographically specific. It's a term that's used much more broadly than that, and sort of indicates anyone who's living on the rugged end of society. And you can sort of see that even though these 3 movies take place in northern Georgia, Texas, and the Nevada desert,
Yeah.
all 3 of the sort of villainous groups are clearly identified as sort of within that hillbilly trope.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I think is really interesting to talk about is that it's sort of ambiguous. And this is something that Anthony Harkins, who's that same professor we just heard from, talks about in his book. And he points out that there are certain qualities that define the stereotype of a hillbilly, and that those qualities can be read positively as well as negative. So a few examples is that a pioneering spirit is something that we think of as being positive, but that can also be read negatively as social and economic backwardness. Similarly, strong family networks and values is something that is positive. We like that. But if you take the negative twist of that, it can be interpreted as incest, domestic violence, bloody family feuds, right? Which are all things negatively associated with the hillbilly character.
Yeah.
And sort of a third one, just to drive the point home, is that living close to the land is something that, we like. There's something nice about that for a lot of people, something that people
Right.
think that there is missing in the city. And there's a common sense wisdom that's necessary for that. But on the negative sides, living close to the land can be thought of as savagery, and common sense wisdom can instead be considered ignorance, right? So there's these positives and these negatives that go together in this stereotype.
Yeah, I hadn't really ever thought about how these things could be flipped in both ways, and hearing you, like, lay out these examples, I'm like, "Oh, I've seen that so many times," which is I think especially the last one of living close to the land is something that so often we want that connection. It's something we support and promote, but then so quickly it's turned into, yeah, a savagery, like you said, that it's something bad, and it's really interesting to think about how quickly it can be turned against someone. It made me think a lot about what we were talking about last episode about the ambiguous space of rural America, because one thing we talked about last time when we were discussing urbanoia and the
Mhm.
reverse of urbanoia was that it wasn't that reverse urbanoia was doing something incredibly positive in depicting rural America, because both of these situations in movies, having the city bring the horror or the rural bring the horror, were relying on a perception that the rural and the urban were separate, were that rural America was inherently different, and it was this sort of inherent perceived like lack of progress, lack of modernity, but the difference was which is more scary, the
Mhm.
lack of it or is modernity scary, but it was still doing something negative and saying, oh, progress doesn't exist in rural America. And this is doing the same thing, which is you can take the hillbilly stereotype as positive or negative, but it's still othering in the sense, which is a problem in general.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd agree.
So yeah, that was super helpful to understand kind of the history of hillbilly and understanding what this stereotype means and does. This is a stereotype that shows up in all three of the movies we're going to talk about. What's going on with these movies, these 70s movies? Can you tell us about these films?
Yeah, for sure. So I will just try to do a brief overview. Again, spoilers are incoming, but since it's been literally 50 years since these movies came out,
Yeah,
I don't feel too bad about it.
you shouldn't.
So let's start with Deliverance. Deliverance, pretty simply, is four suburban friends who are going canoeing on a river in northern Georgia. The reason that they're going canoeing on this river is because it's about to be dammed to create a hydroelectric dam, specifically to provide power for Atlanta, which is a growing city at that point.
Which is where they're from.
Which is where they're from, yes. They're from suburban Atlanta. They're going on this trip, having a nice little manly adventure, and two of the men go ashore in a boat and are sort of inexplicably sexually assaulted and attacked by these two men who are they're clearly locals.
Mhm.
Uh, they are then rescued by their two friends who are in the second canoe. One of the friends shoots the attacker through the chest with an arrow and kills him. The other attacker runs away. So after much discussion, the suburbanites bury the body of the first man and get back on the river, and a pursuit ensues on the river with the second attacker. Next, chronologically, is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which sounds exactly like what it is. A group of teens are sort of taking a bit of a road trip through Texas, and they end up in this slaughterhouse town. They encounter a hitchhiker. The hitchhiker is super weird and into slaughtering stuff.
Yeah, it's a very scary.
Yeah, it's a really intense
Yeah.
scene. Also, not a seatbelt in sight because this is 1974.
The whole lesson of the movie is wear your seatbelt.
Yeah, I
That's
think
so
it would
interesting on you.
it would help.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And just like these things that I like fixate on. And yeah, so they end up sort of exploring this area and sort of one by one end up trespassing basically and sort of enter into this other house, which is where the villainous family lives. They're a family of displaced meat workers who have now turned to killing and eating humans, and they encounter Leatherface, who is
An iconic horror villain.
he is an iconic horror villain. He's got a little skin mask and he wears an apron and he's essentially a butcher and he proceeds to kill and butcher them one by one. And then the third movie is The Hills Have Eyes. Once again, suburban family, this time from Cleveland, is on a road trip. They're on their way to Los Angeles. They sort of get off the main road. Their car breaks down. It actually ends up breaking down in this air base and missile range. It's a nuclear testing site. And there they are attacked by, who else? A family of mutant cannibals who are also sort of hillbillies. And one by one, they're attacked and killed. The remaining three ends up sort of fighting back and defeating the hillbillies. So they get away. But yeah, that's sort of the basic rundown of the movies.
They all came out pretty close to each other.
Mhm.
So, Anya, I've got to ask, is it a coincidence? Is it connected? What's going on with these strange movies in the 70s?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And like, obviously, we can't give a super decisive answer, but I do think that there's a certain reason that movies like that came out sort of clustered at the same time, beyond sort of like the simple trends of movie making that,
Yeah.
are go by decade largely too. So thinking about the 70s, super interesting decade.
Yeah.
I don't remember it very well, but that's okay. Um, so, in that span of time while these movies are coming out, there is a lot of political instability in the United States. The Vietnam War is a big factor. Watergate happens,
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
that scandal's
Big
around
one.
72 to 74. So, sort of right when the first two movies are coming out. There's also a new environmental consciousness that we're going to talk
Mm.
about later that's sort of important, but the first Earth Day is celebrated. The EPA is established. There also is a lot of economic mess that's actually pretty reminiscent to what we've been going through in the last couple of
Oh,
years.
interesting.
Oil prices skyrocket because there's sort of instability with negotiations with OPEC.
Yeah.
There's horrible inflation, a really big recession from around 1973, 1975. So yeah, the 70s is a hot mess, basically.
Yeah, also, like, the women's rights movement is big
Mhm.
during the 70s, sort of civil rights.
Yes.
I mean, it just seems like people were feeling what the turmoil of the 60s were and still living it in the 70s with even more going on.
Yeah, and I feel like it's something that, we can relate to, right? I mean, all the time we're like, the world
Yeah.
is falling apart. There's a new crisis every 5 minutes. Also, we're not the first ones to feel like this. And I
No.
think that the 70s is a really comparable decade, actually, to sort of what we're going through now.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have a pandemic, but they had lots of other stuff going on, including major international conflicts and all that jazz.
All that
So,
jazz.
yeah, we maybe shouldn't be shocked necessarily that some of these movies came out. And I think also importantly, this is sort of in the decade following Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, which really did a lot to put Appalachia sort of in the broader consciousness of the rest of the United States, and is where a lot of imagery, especially that we see in Deliverance, sort of comes from, is straight from that playbook of the camera sort of descending on these Appalachian towns and showing, what was sort of described to the rest of the country as this abject poverty that was sort of internal. All of these things have to do with the era that they were made in.
Yeah. I'm pretty interested by what you were saying about the environmental elements, because I feel like the environment and the landscapes are a character in each of these movies. And so I'm curious what the connection between environmental movements of the 70s, environmental crisis of the 70s, and these three movies might be.
Yes, great question. I actually had a chance to talk to Carter Souls, who is a professor at SUNY Brockport, and he sort of does this eco-horror based analysis. And so, yeah, there is a lot going on here with the environment, like you said. Carol J. Clover, who is somebody who we mentioned in the previous episode, is a film scholar, and she has this line where she writes that in these urbanoia films, the city always comes to the country guilty. And that's because there's sort of an acknowledgement in these movies that the environmental destruction and economic struggles that are happening in the countryside are for the benefit of the city, and therefore for the benefit of the urban or suburban interlopers. So here's a bite from the opening sequence of Deliverance that sort of demonstrates that.
You push a little more power into Atlanta, a little more air conditioners for your smug little suburb, and you know what's gonna happen? We're gonna rape this whole goddamn landscape. We're gonna rape it.
Oh, Lewis, my...
That's an extreme point of view, Lewis.
It is.
So that's an example from Deliverance, but it also holds true in these other two movies as well, right? This isn't necessarily as much about the environment, although, the meat industry is certainly related to environmental issues. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the family is a group of displaced meat workers, right? The hitchhiker says in his sort of introductory scene that people get put out of work because of the new sort of air gun that's being used to slaughter cattle as opposed to the old sledgehammer.
I was at the slaughterhouse.
I got an uncle that works at a slaughterhouse.
Hey, my brother worked there. My grandfather, too. My family's always been in me.
A whole family of Draculas. Hey, man, did you go in that slaughter room or whatever they call it? The place where they shoot the cattle in the head with that big air gun thing.
Oh, that gun's no good.
I was in there once with my uncle.
No way. With a sledge. Yeah, see, that was better. They died better that way.
Well, how come? I thought the gun was better.
Oh, no. with the new way people put out of jobs.
And then in The Hills Have Eyes, there's something similar going on where we know that there's resource extraction in the area because there used to be a silver mine that's dried up.
Yeah.
But there's also this narrative which doesn't entirely work if you actually look closely at the film's timeline, but they make it clear that this is a army missile site and a nuclear testing site.
Will be French fries, human French fries.
No, we are not going to be French fries. We're right here someplace on this little blue road.
Nellis Air Force Base, a nuclear testing site close to the public. Holy shit, Daddy!
If you go back and listen to the grandfather's sort of description of what happened, Papa Jupiter, who's the patriarch of the mutant family, he's actually born in like 1929, which is well before any nuclear testing actually would have been taking place, as we all know from watching Barbie this summer. Or was it Oppenheimer? But so that timeline doesn't really work, but the movie definitely wants you to think, oh, this is a nuclear testing site, and maybe some of the mutant degeneracy that we're seeing in this family is related to that, right? And that's a great example of science being super scary.
Yeah, like even if the timeline of when Papa Jupe was born doesn't line up, it's not a coincidence that, you know, this movie was made at the end of the Vietnam War when people were thinking about, like, what is the damage of war? What can it do to humanity? Even if maybe the literal timeline of these people's birth doesn't line up, it's still what the audience is going to be thinking about. So that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. And just better not to look too closely. The narrative is better that way. So yeah, my bad on that. And this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but I think that the military presence and also lack of presence in The Hills Have Eyes is really interesting, especially when you consider the Vietnam era. So it's 1977. It's a bit later on. This has already sort of been a decade, a moment of embarrassment for the U.S. military, which is supposed to be the supreme fighting force on Earth, right? And the war did not go at all the way that they intended. And I think it's really notable that all of this action, like the terrorizing of this perfect American nuclear family, takes place on military lands, right?
Yeah. Nuclear versus nuclear. Am I right?
So good. And not only does it take place on military lands, but throughout the movie, the Papa Jupiter clan is using military equipment that they've raided to do this, right? They're using walkie-talkies, they're using binoculars. This is equipment that they've stolen from the military. And even though there are jets flying overhead, when Bobby, who's sort of the teenage son in the family, is trying to radio for help, saying, military, please come help us, nobody answers. Nobody hears them except for the mutant family who uses that to tease them.
Also, the patriarch of the nuclear family from Cleveland, I believe, is a police officer.
Yes. Yeah.
And he's sort of the first to get killed in a really gruesome way. Yeah. So even, like, you know, the military complex of the police is wrecked instantly.
We have these institutions of authority, and they've failed entirely in this situation. And even though you're on military land, you see military equipment and planes and jets, they're absent, right? Like they're completely not there. And so that's, I think, one really interesting thing.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the environmental stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the guilt element that you brought up, that the city people are coming in with a guilt, and that clip you played from Deliverance, I think, shows that really well. And one thing I want to say is in the theatrical trailer for Deliverance, there's like this narration. I'll just read it really quickly. It says, "These are the men."
These are the men. Nothing very unusual about them. Suburban guys like you or your neighbor. Nothing very unusual about them until they decided to spend one weekend canoeing down the Cohulawasi River.
Where you going? All right, I'm looking.
These are the men who decided not to play golf that weekend. Instead, they sought the river.
Which one I think is really funny, but also sort of sets them up as, you know, they're just like you. And the interesting thing is they do set up as being like, we have this guilt about the river, about the land that the area we're living in is exploiting and extracting and destroying. But then they needed to do something to allow us to sort of root for them. And Deliverance is based off of a novel, and the author of the novel talks about why he puts in this really, you know, upsetting rape scene. And the author says that he had to put the moral weight of murder on the suburbanites. And it's just interesting that it starts with a guilt, and then they're like, okay, quick, we can't have that be too intense because, as the theatrical trailer says, they're just like you. And so we can't have our audience feeling too upset. Let's flip it and let's show something scary about the rural area, so you don't feel too bad, which I just think is really interesting way this movie is set up. It starts one way and quickly flips to the other.
Yeah, totally. And that's, I think, gets at the heart of one of the most interesting sort of comparisons between these three movies, where you sort of have Deliverance on one side, Texas Chainsaw Massacre on the other, and then maybe Hills Have Eyes sort of in the middle. So all three of these movies have the killer hillbilly, either sort of as a pair or in family form, as the villains, but they're actually treated pretty differently. And so when you think about Deliverance, when you think about the villains, like, who are they? What do we know about them? What do we know about their motives?
Honestly, we know nothing. I mean, there's no explanation. This is the first time we see them. As you said, these two of our main characters in Deliverance come up on shore. They meet these people, and they're instantly met with violence. And the only other time we see locals, we see people who live there, is near the beginning of the movie when our four main guys are interacting with some people that they meet. And yeah, they're treated poorly, with disrespect. They're not nice about being in these other people's space. We're supposed to view them as that there's sort of something wrong with them, even in the way they're shown visually. There's a child who is handicapped, and it's sort of implied very clearly that it's from inbreeding, and there's just an instant understanding that these are others, as we were saying before. They are not the same as our main characters, and that is bad.
Yeah, and they're a little creepy, a little scary. Like, we don't trust them. It's not good. Yeah. So that, yeah, I mean, you're totally right. There is, in Deliverance, basically no attempt at sort of any sort of identification with the villainous hillbillies, right? The other extreme of that is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is a movie where it became a cult classic. Leatherface is one of the most well-known villains sort of in the slasher genre, to the point where people would go to the movies and like root for him while he was doing his murder stuff, which, you know, is maybe taking things a little far, but there is much more effort to sort of show this family sort of in their environment, but also explain to a degree like why they're doing what they're doing, right? Like, we know that they've been displaced, they've been left out of work, and this is their solution. And there's actually a really great quote from Robin Wood, who is a horror critic, when talking about the family and sort of the economics of their life, where he writes, "The family, after all, only carry to its logical conclusion the basic, though unstated, tenet of capitalism, that people have a right to live off of other people."
Whoa.
Which they're doing by, you know, literally eating them.
That's a fascinating quote. Yes. I am super into that.
Yeah, Robin Wood kind of rocks. He also has this point, which is that horror movies can be read by how empathetically they treat the monster, right? Every horror movie has a monster. That monster has to threaten normality in some way, right?
Yeah.
But how we feel about that monster, and also sort of how we feel about normality, can be read differently depending on how they're treated. So in Deliverance, the normal men are the suburbanites. We are immediately aligned with them in the voiceover, like you said. Yep. And once they've been assaulted, you're totally on their side. They can do whatever they want, right? Because the people that are there are weird and scary anyways, right? There's no identification. Yep. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you're in it with the family. You understand why they're doing what they're doing. And there are these shots of Leatherface, which where Leatherface is seen sort of fretting, like all of these people are coming into his house. Like, they just walk right in, these teenagers, they walk right into his house, and he kills them and, you know, puts them in the meat freezer or whatever, sort of as a reaction. But he's not going out hunting them. They're literally walking into his home, and he's killing sort of almost in defense, right?
Yeah. And also there's a family element of Leatherface and his family that, like, as you were talking about in our original understanding of the hillbilly stereotype, is that close family ties is something we view as positive in some ways. And the Leatherface family, there's a grandfather, there's, you know, they're taking care of their family, they're feeding and supporting their family, they're doing it through murder and cannibalism, but there's that element of sympathy because you're like, look, they're providing for each other, they're respecting their elders.
Right, even grandma's corpse is preserved in the attic.
True.
So sort of in the middle, we have The Hills Have Eyes, where, you know, we actually get a lot of visual shots from the point of view of the sort of Papa Jupiter clan, which is something that, depending on how your level of film broiness, you may care about more than others. But I mean, physically, like, we're identifying with the camera who's looking at them from the point of view of these people.
Yes.
And it is clear that this family is starving, right? And nobody goes down those roads anymore. The natural resources have already been plundered. It's been sort of taken over by the military-industrial complex to do dangerous things with. and they don't have any other resources, nor do they really have a chance of fitting in with mainstream society. So yeah, there is this level of thinking about things from their perspective to a degree. And one thing that I want to get into, you asked way back about sort of the environmental lens of this, is that there is sort of a genre called eco-horror, which at its most basic deals with man versus natural elements, non-human elements,
Right.
and that are in some ways seen as sort of getting revenge for Mother Earth. And the sort of the most famous example of this would be Jaws, right? It's men and women versus shark. Shark being the non-human entity that they are faced with. And there's an argument that can be made that the killer hillbillies' proximity to the land can make them sort of a stand-in for the non-human element of eco-horror, right? Which of course is, like we said, something to think about and be challenged, right? We don't like saying that people are not actually people,
of course,
but through this lens, it can be thought about that way. And in that sense, the killer hillbilly can almost act as an agent getting revenge on the urban or suburban family, almost on behalf of Mother Earth.
Yeah. I mean, so notably in the trailer that the nuclear family from Cleveland is traveling in and staying in the Hills of Eyes, there's a poster of Jaws hanging up there.
Oh, good point.
It almost feels like they're acknowledging the same thing. Who's the shark in the situation? That's the question. But yeah, I really like this framing of thinking about it. I think it makes me like these movies a lot more, again, noting the issue with viewing people as not people, but this idea of righteous revenge is an interesting way to view it.
Yeah, and here's actually, there's a a clip, I almost said a bite, haha. You'll see why I'm laughing. There's a bite from this movie where Papa Jupiter is literally eating the father, the patriarch from Cleveland.
You come out here and stick your life in my face? Stick your fingers in my pie? That was a bad mistake. I thought you were smart and tough. You're stupid.
Yeah, you sure are.
You're nothing. I'm gonna watch your goddamn car rush down. Yes, I will.
Right, Mama, tell him.
I'll see the wind blow your dried up seeds away. I'll eat the heart of your stinking memory. I'll eat the brains of your kids. I'm in. You're out. Bye.
That's a great speech.
Yeah, it's a crazy speech. And of course it can be read right on the sort of individual level of, this is my family, you're got in my way, you're attacking us and I'm gonna get you. But there's also this very clear, you come from the city, you have this new car and I'm gonna watch it rust, right? Like I'm gonna watch it be destroyed.
Wow.
Which I think sort of makes that argument from the eco lens. I also love something that you said earlier on, which is that these weren't your favorite movies to watch. And when I was watching them, they weren't mine either, but they've really become my favorite movies to think about. And I think that for me, that's that is the appeal that I'm finding in these movies, is that they're so interesting. But I also do want to caution us on a point about that, right? Like, I love the idea of getting excited about sort of this like eco-revenge narrative played out through the killer hillbilly. And I think it's fascinating. And I think that there's definitely an element of that's true. And I also think that there are definitely some people who watch those movies and think about that, whether those be diehard horror fans who like know what to look for, or sort of the more academic types who, literally study this thing for a living. But I also think it's important to note that that's probably not the first thing that most people are thinking when they're leaving the theater, or in this case, probably rewatching repeatedly.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that there's a comparison that all of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a metaphor for the Nixon administration and Watergate. That's super interesting. That's super cool. But probably you're watching it and maybe not thinking about a play-by-play of Watergate. And if you're not, well, it doesn't say great things about the people in rural Texas, so...
Right. Exactly, right. And, we've already established that Deliverance is the least sympathetic, at least, as far as depicting killer hillbillies can be sympathetic.
Sure.
But it had a huge lasting impact on people's perceptions of Appalachia and rural America, which we'll get into later. But I mean, I was this summer telling somebody that I was working on this podcast and that Deliverance was one of the movies we were going to talk about. And she had moved nearly 30 years ago to sort of southern Kentucky. And she was like, I legitimately thought it was going to be like Deliverance when I moved down there.
Wow.
And this is, you know, a highly educated woman. I really, really like her.
Yeah.
And that was the impression she had because that was what was in the media, right? And so,
Wow.
you know, it is so much fun and so interesting, at least for me,
Me too.
to go deep and think about all of these different implications about, you know, what the politics of these movies actually may be. But that doesn't mean that the larger takeaway for a lot of people is not going to be,
yeah,
scary hillbillies.
That's a great point. And I really appreciate you leading us through this kind of conversation because it is so fascinating. And I think putting movies in the context of the time that they're in and really thinking about why was this made, what does it mean, is awesome. But it is important to understand that you have to look at a movie without all the context and without the layer of intellectualizing and think about what is just the stereotype on screen or what's just the image. Even if you've never seen the movie, especially a movie like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's in the popular opinion as just sort of a thing you reference without even seeing it. And so therefore you have to understand that some people are going to be like, this person you were talking to, think of a whole area based off of a general concept of a movie they've heard of or have seen, but it's really pervasive and that can be harmful. And I think we'll talk about the real world implications of these movies a lot more throughout the podcast and specifically in the 5th episode of this podcast. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely stay tuned for that.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited to talk about that more.
Thank you so much, Anya. This was really interesting. You've given me new appreciation for these movies and a new way to watch them. And I never thought I was going to rewatch them because there was so much screaming, but you've convinced me I'm going to rewatch them and bring some critical thinking to them. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. I had so much fun doing this deep dive, and I think I might keep on diving deeper on my own time. Can you believe it?
That's amazing.
The Rural Horror Picture Show is a product of Rural Remix. Special thanks to Professor Carter Souls for helping with research for this episode. Original music was composed by Quincy Polver and Leo Pozell. Cover art for the series was drawn by Nat Nichols. Thank you to our executive producers, Joel Cohen and Adam Georgie, associate producer Teresa Collins, and the staff of the Daily Yonder and Rural Assembly. This series was edited and produced by Susanna Brown and Anya Patron Slepyan.